I moved to a remote cabin in the Cascades about 4 years ago. I was 32 at the time, burnt out from a decade of high frequency training in Chicago. I wanted silence. I wanted a place where the only thing I had to worry about was whether I had enough firewood for the night. The cabin was old, built in the late 70s, with thick cedar logs and a stone fireplace that smelled like decades of pine smoke. My nearest neighbor, a man named Miller, lived about 2 miles down the mountain. He was a typical mountain local, quiet, observant, and rarely seen without his rusted out 1994 Ford F-150. For the first few years, it was paradise, but everything changed during the winter of 2022. The weather reports had been screaming about a once-in-a-generation polar vortex for days. I had prepared as best I could, stocked up on canned goods, filled the kerosene lamps, and made sure my woodpile was massive. The snow started on a Tuesday afternoon. By 6 p.m., the world outside was a wall of white. The wind wasn't just blowing, it was screaming, a high-pitched, mournful sound that made the entire cabin vibrate. At 9 p.m., the power lines finally gave up. I was plunged into total darkness, save for the orange flicker of the fireplace. I was sitting by the fire, reading a book by lamplight, when I heard it. A dull, rhythmic thud, thud, thud. At first, I thought it was just the house settling under the weight of the snow, but it wasn't coming from the walls or the roof. It was coming from directly beneath my feet. Now, here's the thing. My cabin doesn't have a basement. It sits on a solid concrete slab foundation. There is no crawl space. There is no plumbing down there. It's just solid stone and earth. The thumping started in the corner of the living room and slowly, deliberately migrated toward my bedroom. It sounded like something heavy was being dragged through wet clay, directly under the floorboards. I stood up, gripping my fire poker, my heart hammering against my ribs. I followed the sound to the hallway. It stopped. I waited for 10 minutes in total silence. Just as I was about to convince myself it was a localized tremor or an animal outside, a voice, tiny, metallic, and impossibly thin, crackled through the room. It was my emergency hand crank radio. It was sitting on the kitchen counter, and the battery had been dead for weeks. There was no way it should have been working. "He's not wearing his boots, Silas," the radio whispered through a layer of heavy static. My name isn't Silas. My name is Sam. But the voice sounded so certain, so intimate, that for a second, I felt like my own identity was slipping away. I smashed the radio off the counter with the poker. It shattered, but the static lingered in the air for a few seconds before fading into the howl of the wind. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in a chair facing the front door, watching the snow pile up against the glass. When the sun finally rose, a weak gray light filtered through the blizzard, the wind had died down to a whisper. I put on my heavy parka and stepped out on the porch to clear the doorway. That's when I saw them. The porch was covered in a fresh layer of powder, leading from the edge of the woods across the yard and up to steps or sets of tracks. They weren't animal prints, they were human footprints. Perfect, clear, barefoot human footprints. They were deep, indicating the person was heavy or perhaps carrying something. They circled my cabin exactly 3 times. I looked at the thermometer on the porch post. It read -15 degrees Fahrenheit. No human being could walk 10 feet in that weather barefoot without losing their toes to frostbite, let alone circle a house 3 times in waist-deep snow. The tracks didn't lead back to the woods. They stopped abruptly at my front door. I looked down at the threshold. There were no prints leading away. Whoever or whatever had made them was either still standing right in front of me, invisible, or they had somehow gone under the house. I felt a surge of pure, primal panic. I couldn't stay there. If the roads were blocked, I'd have to hike to Miller's place. It was a 2-mile trek, but I had snowshoes and a GPS. I grabbed my pack, my handgun, and my keys, and I started walking. The trek to Miller's house was a nightmare. Every time I turned around, I felt like I saw a shadow flitting between the pine trees. I kept hearing that metallic whispering in my head. He's not wearing his boots. When I finally reached Miller's clearing, his truck was gone. His house was a small one-story ranch-style place. The front door was wide open, swinging back and forth in the freezing wind, hitting the frame with a rhythmic thud, 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 matching the sound I heard under my floorboards the night before. "Miller!" I called out, my voice cracking. No answer. I stepped inside, my gun drawn. The interior was freezing, the fireplace was cold, but the living room, I'll never forget what I saw in that living room. Miller was a minimalist, but the room was now packed. There were shoes, thousands of them, work boots, sneakers, high heels, baby shoes, old leather brogues. They were arranged in perfect concentric circles covering every inch of the floor, all pointing toward Miller's armchair in the center. Miller was sitting in the chair. He was wearing his winter coat and his hat, but his feet were bare. His skin was a translucent, waxy blue. He was staring at the wall with wide, milky eyes. I approached him slowly, checking for a pulse. He was frozen solid. But as I leaned in, I noticed a piece of paper clutched in his hand. I pried it loose. It was a map of the mountain, my mountain, and there was a red circle drawn around my cabin. Underneath the circle, Miller had scrawled one sentence over and over again until the ink ran dry. "I gave them my boots so they would stop knocking. I gave them my boots so they would stop knocking." Suddenly, the engine of Miller's truck roared into life in the driveway. I ran to the window. The truck was empty. No one was in the driver's seat. But the tires were spinning, kicking up plumes of snow, and the horn began to blare, one long, continuous, deafening note. I looked back at Miller. His head had lolled to the side, and for a split second, I swear his milky eyes tracked me. His mouth opened, and that same metallic, static-filled voice from the radio came out of his frozen throat. "Sam, why are you still wearing your boots? They're waiting for their turn." The aftermath. I don't remember the hike back. I don't remember calling the police from my satellite phone. All I remember is the feeling of the wind trying to peel the skin off my face. The police found Miller's body, but they never found the shoes. When they arrived, the house was empty, just a frozen man in a chair. They attributed his death to hypothermia and paradoxical undressing, a phenomenon where freezing victims feel hot and strip off their clothes. They said the shoes were likely a hallucination brought on by my own early-stage hypothermia. But I know what I saw. I sold the cabin a month later. I moved back to the city to an apartment on the 22nd floor, as far away from the ground as possible. But sometimes, on very cold nights when the wind hits the glass just right, I hear a dull thud, thud, thud coming from the ceiling. And every morning, I check my hallway. So far, there are no barefoot tracks in the carpet. But I've started leaving an old pair of sneakers outside my front door every night, just in case they decide to stop knocking. I've been a long-haul trucker for 15 years. I've driven through tornadoes in Oklahoma, fog so thick in London you couldn't see your own hood ornament, and heat waves in Arizona that melted the asphalt. I thought I'd seen everything the road could throw at a person. I was wrong. 2 winters ago, I was hauling a load of electronics from Chicago to Denver right before Christmas. The timeline was tight, and the bonus for early delivery was huge. So when the weather reports started flashing warnings about a massive blizzard hitting Nebraska, I made the stupid decision to push through. I figured my rig weighed 30 tons. I could handle a little snow. By the time I hit the Wyoming border, Interstate 80 was a graveyard. The snow wasn't falling down. It was falling sideways, driven by 60-mile-per-hour winds that turned the world into a swirling white void. Visibility was zero. I was crawling along at maybe 10 miles an hour, using the rumble strips on the shoulder just to know I was still on the road. Then the worst happened. A fuel line froze. My engine sputtered, coughed, and died.
The silence that followed was deafening, just the sound of the wind trying to tear the cab apart. I knew the protocol: stay in the vehicle, wrap up in blankets, wait for help. But my cab heater was dead, and the temperature was dropping toward 20 below zero. I was going to freeze to death in that metal box. I grabbed my emergency flashlight and looked out the passenger window. Miraculously, through a momentary break in the snow, I saw a faint yellow glow about a quarter-mile off the highway. It looked like an old service station sign, flickering against the storm. I had no choice. I bundled up in every piece of clothing I had and stepped out into the blizzard. The walk nearly killed me. The snow was thigh deep, and the wind kept knocking me flat. By the time I reached the source of the light, my eyelashes were frozen together. It was a gas station, but it looked like it had fallen out of a time warp from 1955. There were two ancient pumps out front with the old analog dials. The sign above the garage simply said gas and repairs in peeling red letters. The lights in sight were on, casting a sickly yellow square onto the snow. I hammered on the glass door. It was unlocked. I stumbled inside, collapsing onto the linoleum floor, gasping for air that didn't feel like razor blades. The inside was unbelievably hot. A massive cast iron wood stove was roaring in the center of the room, radiating heat that felt almost violent after the cold outside. The air was thick with the smell of stale coffee, old engine grease, and something else underneath it, something sweet and cloying, like rotting fruit. "Rough night for a drive, son." I jumped. Standing behind the counter was a man who looked to be in his late 70s. He was wearing pristine mechanic's coveralls, too clean for a working garage, and a perfectly pressed grease monkey cap. He was smiling, but his eyes, obscured by thick glasses, didn't seem to be moving. "My rig died on the interstate," I managed to joke out. "Need to use your phone." The old man shook his head slowly. "Lines are down. Been down since noon. Storm took out the cell towers too. You're stuck here with old Pop until the plows come through, which won't be until tomorrow at best." He poured a cup of black coffee from a stained glass carafe and set it on the counter. "Drink up, warm your bones." I hesitated. Every instinct in my body was telling me to run back into the storm. The heat in the room was oppressive, making me dizzy, but I was freezing. I took the coffee. It tasted burnt and metallic, but the warmth was heavenly. "I'm Pop," he said, still smiling that frozen smile. "Don't get many visitors these days, especially in this weather. The last folks who came through, well, they were in a real hurry." I sat by the stove, trying to thaw out. Pop went back to work behind the counter, polishing tools that already looked brand new. He didn't speak much, just hummed an off-key tune that sounded vaguely like a church hymn. In the corner of the shop, sitting on a greasy shelf, was an old Bakelite radio. It was tuned to an AM news station that was barely audible through heavy static. I tried to focus on the announcer's voice, desperate for any news about the road conditions. The anchor was talking about missing persons. "Authorities are still searching for the Miller family, last seen 3 days ago driving a blue sedan westbound on I-80. They were reportedly heading towards Salt Lake City for the holidays. If anyone has seen a 2018 Honda Accord with Illinois plates..." My blood ran cold. 3 days ago. That was before the storm hit. They should have made it through easily. Pop noticed me listening. He stopped polishing a wrench and looked over the top of his glasses at me. "Sad business," he murmured. "The road eats people up out here. People think they can conquer nature with their fancy cars and GPS. Nature always wins." He stared at me for a beat too long. "You have a family waiting for you, son?" "Yeah," I lied. "I'm single. My wife and kids are in Denver." "Good. A man needs people waiting for him. Makes him fight harder to stay alive." He chuckled, a dry, rasping sound like sandpaper on wood. "Or it makes the tragedy sweeter when he doesn't show up." The coffee suddenly tasted vile in my mouth. I put the cup down. "I need to use the bathroom," I said, needing to get away from his gaze. "Through the back, past the tire rack." The back of the shop was dark, lit only by the light spilling from the main room. As I walked toward the bathroom door, I passed a large metal shelving unit. It was marked Lost and Found in handwritten marker. It wasn't normal lost and found items like sunglasses or an umbrella. The shelves were packed with high-quality winter gear, expensive North Face jackets, heavy-duty snow boots that looked brand new, designer scarves, children's snowsuits. It looked like the inventory of a sporting goods store. Why would so many people leave behind their most essential survival gear in the middle of winter? I reached out and touched a bright pink children's mitten. It was stiff, like it had been soaked in water and then dried near high heat. My heart was pounding against my ribs now. I needed to get out. I turned away from the bathroom and started heading back toward the front door, planning to take my chances in the storm. As I passed the counter, the static on the radio cleared up for just a second. The announcer's voice cut through the room, crystal clear. Police are urging anyone who sees the vehicle to exercise caution. Mr. Miller is described as wearing a distinctive silver watch engraved with the coordinates of his wedding location on the back casing. I froze. Lying on the counter, right next to where Pop was polishing his tools, was a silver watch. It was a nice watch, heavy and expensive looking. It was sitting face down on an oily rag. I don't know what possessed me to do it. Maybe it was the adrenaline. Maybe it was sheer stupidity. But while Pop's back was turned toward the stove, I reached out and flipped the watch over. On the back casing, etched into the metal, were numbers: 41 degrees, 53 minutes north, 87 degrees, 37 minutes west. Coordinates. A shadow fell over me. I looked up. Pop was standing right in front of me. He wasn't smiling anymore. He was holding a 2-foot-long tire iron in his hand. His glasses reflected the firelight, making his eyes look like two burning coals. "You know," Pop said, his voice devoid of any folksy charm, completely flat and cold. "The problem with folks these days is curiosity. They can't just take a warm cup of coffee and be grateful. They always have to look where they don't belong." He raised the tire iron. "The Millers were nice folks, but they weren't prepared for the cold. I had to help them, just like I'm going to help you." I didn't think. I reacted. I grabbed the pot of boiling hot coffee from the stove and threw the entire contents in his face. He screamed, a guttural, inhuman sound, and clawed at his burning eyes. I bolted for the door. I hit the crash bar full force, tumbling out into the snowstorm. I didn't stop running. I didn't care about the cold. I ran blindly through the whiteout until I slammed into my own truck. I climbed inside, locked the doors, and grabbed the emergency flare gun I kept under the seat. I sat there for 6 hours, gun pointed at the door, shivering uncontrollably, waiting for a face to appear in the window. When the snowplows finally dug me out the next morning, the state troopers almost didn't believe me. They said I was delirious from hypothermia. But they checked. They found the station about a mile back. It was abandoned. Had been for 10 years, they said. The roof was partially collapsed. There was no electricity, no working stove, no lights. But when they went inside, in the middle of the snow-covered, ruined floor, they found a single, steaming cup of fresh coffee sitting on a rotted counter. And in the back room, hidden under a tarp, they found a pile of driver's licenses. Dozens of them. The Miller family's IDs were right on top. They never found Pop. They never found the bodies. I don't drive night routes anymore. And if it starts to snow, even a little bit, I pull over at the nearest busy truck stop and I wait. I don't care how late the load is, because I know what's waiting out there, in the dark and the cold, in places that aren't supposed to exist. And I know that someday, he's going to...
I was a professional skier for most of my 20s, alpine racing mostly. When you spend that much time on the edge of a mountain, you develop a sixth sense for the snow. You can feel the pack shifting under your feet. You can smell a storm coming before it even hits the radar. I've been avalanche certified for a decade. I know the protocols. I know the risks. But the mountains have a way of humbling you when you get too comfortable. In the winter of 2021, I decided to do a solo backcountry run in a remote range in British Columbia. I wanted to hit a specific line, a steep, pristine powder bowl that few people ever see. The forecast predicted light snow, nothing a veteran like me couldn't handle. I reached the summit just as the blue hour was fading into a gray, oppressive dusk. The wind had shifted suddenly, coming from the north with a bite that felt like needles on my skin. I should have turned back then. Every manual, every instructor, every ounce of common sense told me to retreat. But I was arrogant. I thought I was faster than the mountain. I dropped in. The first few turns were perfect, that weightless, floating sensation that every skier lives for. But about halfway down, the world decided to move. It wasn't a roar. An avalanche of that size sounds like 1,000 bedsheets being torn at once. A Class 2 slide, not enough to bury a house, but more than enough to turn a human being into a rag doll. The snow beneath my skis simply vanished. I was tumbling, a chaotic mess of limbs and fiberglass. I remember the sensation of my left leg snapping back. Not a break, but a tear that felt like a hot iron being pressed into my knee. I slammed into a buried rock, and everything went black for a second. When I came to, the blizzard had arrived in full force. I was lying in a heap, half buried. My left ski was gone, likely lost under 6 feet of debris. My left leg was a useless, throbbing weight. The silence of a mountain during a blizzard is the loneliest sound in the world. I checked my GPS, it was dead. The cold had drained the battery in minutes. I looked up at the sky, but there was no sky, just a swirling, suffocating curtain of white. I knew then, with a cold certainty that surpassed the temperature, that I was going to die on that ridge. I began the death crawl. I used my one remaining ski pole as a crutch, dragging my mangled leg through the deep powder. Every inch was an agony. I was losing feeling in my fingers. Hypothermia doesn't feel like freezing. It feels like getting very, very sleepy. I just wanted to lie down in the soft, white bed and close my eyes. "You're going the wrong way." The voice was so clear it startled me. I looked up, squinting through the ice caked on my goggles. A figure was standing about 20 yards away. He was dressed in vintage gear, an old-school neon blue one-piece suit from the late 80s, a color that shouldn't have been visible in that light, yet it glowed. He was on skis, perfectly balanced, despite the steepness of the slope. "I can't walk," I managed to wheeze. He glided toward me with an effortless grace. He didn't have a backpack, he didn't have a helmet, just a pair of old-fashioned goggles and a thin scarf. When he reached me, he didn't say his name. He just reached out and hooked my arm under mine, hoisting me up with a strength that felt impossible for a man of his lean build. "Lean on me," he said. His voice was odd. It didn't sound like it was coming from his mouth. It sounded like it was vibrating inside my own skull. "We have to move. The mountain is hungry tonight." For the next hour, we moved in a trance. I had my arm draped over his shoulder, and he practically carried me. We were moving at a pace I couldn't have achieved even if I were healthy. He knew every rock, every hidden crevice, every safe passage through the trees. I tried to make conversation, mostly to stay conscious. "You live around here?" I asked, my teeth chattering. "I used to," he replied. He looked towards the summit, his goggles reflecting nothing but the white void. "I haven't used my legs in a while. It's nice to feel the ground again, even if it's cold." I didn't think much of it at the time. I figured he was just an eccentric local, or maybe I was more delirious than I realized. We reached the edge of the trailhead, where the service road began.
I could see the faint lights of the ranger station in the distance. I felt a surge of relief so strong I practically collapsed. I can take it from here, I whispered, leaning against a large pine tree. Thank you. You saved my life. I closed my eyes for maybe 5 seconds, just catching my breath. When I opened them, he was gone. There was no sound of skis retreating, no whoosh of wind. I looked at the fresh, undisturbed snow where he had been standing just a moment before. I looked at my own tracks, a messy, dragged line where I had been limping. But beside my tracks, where the stranger had been supporting my entire weight for over a mile, there was nothing. No ski marks, no boot prints. The snow was as smooth as a sheet of glass. I spent 3 days in the hospital. The doctors told me I was lucky to keep the leg. They said the adrenaline must have given me the strength to hike out on my own. I didn't hike out alone, I told the nurse. She stopped mid-stride, her face turning pale. She didn't say anything at first. She just walked over to the desk and brought back a local newspaper from 3 weeks ago. She pointed to a small article on the fourth page. Search called off for Thomas Miller, 29, experienced skier missing after solo expedition in the northern range. There was no photo in the paper, but she described him to me based on the missing persons posters that were all over town. He was wearing a bright neon blue one-piece suit, she said, her voice trembling. His family said it was his lucky suit from his father. They never found him. They think he was buried in a slide on the same ridge where you were found. I haven't gone back to the mountains alone since that day. Sometimes when I'm sitting in my living room and the wind picks up, I feel a phantom weight on my shoulder, the ghost of an arm holding me up. I don't know why he chose to help me. Maybe he just didn't want anyone else to become part of the mountain. But I still have the old scarf I found caught on my jacket zipper when I reached the hospital. It's a thin wool scarf. It smells like pine needles and the cold that never goes away. And whenever I touch it, I hear that static-filled voice in the back of my head. It's nice to feel the ground again.